Hey everybody, this is Jason for the Alliance Project here. Got part 3 that you guys been waiting for. It's actually like part 5 if you really consider it, but part 3 of the series I've made. It just correlates with some older info I had, but I didn't present it as well as I'd like to back then, so I'm going to kind of represent it and give it to you guys hopefully a lot more fluent, have it flow a little bit more. So I apologize for not being as active on here. I've been really busy the past I'd say I don't know, past month or so. It's been hectic, and life does that to you sometimes. It's the good kind of busy though, so it's not like I'm too busy to eat or take care of myself or my animals or my plants or anything like that. It's not like that. It's just sometimes I feel like I can't give people the energy they deserve. So all things considered, I hope that just hope that clears up some things for you guys. I'm not abandoning anybody, just been busy. So yeah, we'll get right into it here in one moment. So let me pull up my my notes. I tried to do it, make this presentation nice and fluent, like I said. So I'll go ahead and cut out all the bad spots, and here we go. Basically, the last few thousand years, we've worked around perception of history. The stories have been changed and altered, mistranslated, misunderstood, and basically everything in between as we rounded the curve of the precession of the equinoxes, if you will. Modern views of our history account for many things, but completely dismissed many important pieces of the puzzle. For example, the pyramids. There's no modern theory that accounts for how these could be made individually. Each block pulled, with 50 men couldn't drag it alone, and there were hundreds of miles, and then stack them 450 feet in the air in such a precise way even modern technology can't achieve it. Not to mention having it lined precisely with both Orion's belt and the golden mean, like the Fibonacci, not the Fibonacci spiral, but the golden mean ratio. And the Fibonacci spiral. I mean, it's just the Fibonacci spiral is just a less accurate way of doing the golden mean. It's like basically on a primary nodal point of every sacred site on the earth. So that's just one example. So our history is not what we think. Many things that we've been led to believe to be true are simply not. And the biggest field basically that does this, that has to do with this, is archaeology, if you really consider it. Recently, some monumental discoveries have been found that have been rocking the foundations of what we know about ourselves and the history of the earth. Many ancient cities, such as Babylon, Erech, Akkad, they were written about in the Bible and other ancient texts. They were always thought to be myths because no one could prove they existed. And then one of them was found, and this led to the finding of another and another. And inside one of these cities, archaeologists found cylindrical clay tablets hidden deep within the earth. I know I've touched on this a lot, but I want to make sure that when you pick up a video, you can kind of have a full thought, and you might not have watched part 2 or part 1, and you might not have the time, so I'd like to at least give a background. These tablets were completely covered in text written in cuneiform, and they tell an ancient story that spans back over hundreds and thousands of years on this planet, describing the history of Earth and the origins of the human race in great detail. Now, the first thing we want to do is say that we're not making things, as people want to say that these people were making things up. They didn't know, so they just were creating tales to explain where they came from. However, if that was true, then how can they explain how they knew so many things about the universe and get it right? So, I mean, the Dogons, we went on to them. They knew about the distance of the planets in the solar system, but the Sumerians knew even more about them. They describe them in great detail in these Sumerian records. They also knew about the precession of the equinoxes. And that's a tough one for historians to understand because it takes over 2,000 years of continuous observation to actually learn that the Earth has a wobble. The Sumerians had this information from day one of their civilization. A man named Zechariah Sitchin was spent a long time transcribing these texts and put them all together. And he has a lot of books out. 1 second, if you will. Let me do one thing. Let me pause this for 1 minute. All right, so pick up where we left off. Both the Dogons and the Sumerians have similar accounts and shared information about this. But everything that Sitchin says in the tablets, we can verify through the writings of Thoth. And that is what resonates most true about Sitchin's work with me. So there's also a guy that channels a dude named Adamus, if you'd like to look into that more. And he says a lot of the same things. And there's a huge connection between all of these stories. Now, the story spans back hundreds and thousands of years into the past and talks about a team at Nibiru seeding the human race, Adam and Eve, and the children of Lemuria. This portion of the story is really interesting, but not the most crucial to know. We're not going to be covering this time, and we are, however, going to be picking up the story at the end of Lemuria and discussing the events of Atlantis up to present day. What I'm going to tell you is a mix of these records, along with what we have been told from Thoth for the final details. I'm not going to tell you what I'm saying is fact, but I'm simply saying to decide for yourself. And this information is out there. Okay, so there was a time long ago when humans existed at a very high level of consciousness. We were interdimensional. We communicated through feelings and thought, much rather than speaking and writing. It would seem very primitive to them at that time. We primarily lived on a large string of islands called Lemuria. But there was a consciousness shift. We moved up in consciousness, and the islands of Lemuria sank. It went beneath the ocean, and at the time of this consciousness shift, there was a new continent that rose out of the ocean. We called it Atlantis. So in the early 1900s, the spiritual path of the United States was similar to what was happening today. People began to learn about meditation and study ancient lands like Atlantis and Lemuria. We were actually found quite a bit of evidence that Lemuria existed. It had to do with coral. And the sea and the ocean does rise and fall, and coral can exist up to only 100 feet under the surface of the water. In 1910, the surface of the ocean was probably higher because they were able to see coral rings heading away from Easter Island for a great distance. These rings were estimated to be found at 1,800 feet, which means for them to exist, the water would have to be much higher and sank slowly. Probably more important, they would also found the exact same fauna and flora from the Hawaiian Islands all the way to Easter Islands. And that's a great distance. But if you look at a map, you'll see a long string that, according to Thoth, used to run along the western shores of Lemuria. It is only on these islands that they have the same flora and fauna. So the same trees, bugs, bacteria, everything. Science can only explain this if there were closer land bridges between these islands at one point. And that's it. Although they were studying all this at that time, World War I began soon after, and we lost interest in spirituality in the ancient lands for a very long time. After the sinking of Lemuria and the rising of Atlantis, the first human race became scattered. We moved to various islands and continents all over the world because we didn't have a home yet. We didn't know where to go. At that time, there was about 1,000 humans at a very high consciousness, more than all the rest. And they were called the Nakals. Today, we know them as the Ascended Masters. The Nakals began preparing Atlantis to be our new home. They projected their energies across the surface of the continent in the form of the Tree of Life. Not with 10 circles, but with 12, an extra at the top of the island and an extra at the bottom in the water. There were 10 components to the mainland, and even though it extended over hundreds of miles on the surface, it was projected to the accuracy of a single atom, supposedly. We chose to move to Atlantis because of the Kundalini and humans, and the Kundalini, basically, the Kundalini of the planet was there. The Kundalini is often referred to as the energy serpent that runs up and down your spinal column. When activated, it provides an immense amount of energy to all of your chakras. The Earth itself also has a Kundalini because the Earth is alive like an organism, running from the centers of the planet to a specific place on the surface. Wherever the Kundalini resides, the people there become the spiritual leaders of the world. The Earth chose Atlantis to be the new energetic center of the planet, you could say. And Atlantis's Kundalini moved to the mountain. After Atlantis, it moved to the mountains of Tibet. That's why the Buddhists were the leaders of spirituality for the last 13,000 years. And it was a very pure place. And then it moved again within the last 10 years. But that's a story for a different time. If you want to read more about that, check out the book, The Serpent of Light by Drunvalo Melchizedek. And suddenly, in a sudden day, the Nakals put the breath of life into the Tree of Life on the surface of Atlantis. They created vortex of energy rotating around each of the circle vortexes of the Tree of Life. And the children of Lemuria began to be called forth in the millions upon millions to settle across the planet. And it's like a magnet. It pulled a great migration for the Lemurians, us, basically. However, the Lemurian body of consciousness had only reached the age of 12 as a planetary consciousness. Because we were right brain, we were a female species. Like a 12-year-old girl, basically. Some of our centers weren't working as they had worked. With these energies, as they started working with their chakras and the spiritual energies, they could only master 8 of the 10. And each migrating Lemurian was attracted to one of these 8 centers of Atlantis, depending on the nature of the individual. So you could picture the Tree of Life filling up. Since they didn't work with 2 spiritual energies, they didn't migrate to either part of those. It depended on the nature of the individual, where they settled. And they began to build buildings there, and it left 2 vortexes with nobody using them, not a single person. So for these 2 vortexes, they were pulling life towards them. And in life, you can't have an empty place. Life will find a way to fill it. It's similar if you're driving along the freeway in another car. If you drop behind too far, another car would just pull in and fill in the place. That's exactly what happened on Atlantis. The Lemurians had only 8 of their vortexes. And the Mayan records clearly state that there were 10 cities in Atlantis. And you can read these records yourself. It's located, the document itself is located in the British Museum. This document's estimated about 3,500 years old, and it gives in great detail the sinking of Atlantis. To fill these 2 empty vortexes, according to Thoth, extraterrestrial races stepped in, not 1 but 2 completely different races. The first race were supposedly the Hebrews coming from the future, they said, but we don't really know too much into that. We can just kind of only just go from what they were telling us right? So it's like if you read their book, it even says that they came up from off planet, but we don't know exactly where from where exactly. It was like the Hebrews were kind of like a kid that failed the 5th grade and didn't make it, so he had to be held back to learn the great spiritual lesson all over again. They got all the left brain stuff, but they didn't get the right brain aspect as much of the evolving consciousness, so they didn't graduate to the next level of evolution. So they had to do it again. And they knew a lot of things that we didn't, so they brought many concepts and ideas to us that we weren't aware of yet. Now, if this is true, this would explain quite a few things about the Hebrew people in general. They seem to have a sacred geometry hidden within their culture. And it also puts perspective on the story of Exodus. Perhaps Moses incarnated into this lifetime to free the Hebrews because they were not direct descendants of humans and were being treated unfairly. Or could it have been that Moses was visited by an ascended master of the Hebrews who guided him to free the people? Given what we know about dimensions and consciousness, it definitely puts a fresh perspective onto the old stories that didn't make much sense. We could talk about that a lot more, but let's continue on and talk about the vortexes again. So the other one, the Hebrews are coming to Atlantis, and it benefited our evolution in the long run. The other race that stepped in caused big problems. These beings came from a nearby planet called Mars, and according to Thoth, Mars used to look a lot like Earth, a little less than 1 million years ago. It was beautiful, had oceans of water, trees, it was just fantastic there. So something had to happen, and that actually has to do with the video that me and Rex just did. It was called the Lucifer experiment. From the very beginning of creation, everything in creation is simply an experiment, you could say. Creation itself was just consciousness creating and inhabiting itself, and there's no divine plan, essentially. The spirit can do whatever it wants. Having said that, the spirit decides to cut itself off from the rest of consciousness and create a separate reality on its own. It can do that. This is called the Lucifer experiment. Because spirit is God, it can do no wrong, so you can't call it wrong. So what we've been really led to believe, that Lucifer's evil in that sense, and the devil and this and that, it just isn't true, like in the original sense of the word. It just means perceiving the reality differently. It's not a unity perception, but a oneness, not a unity perception and a oneness. It's more of a duality perception. There's a tree of life, like a flower of life for the Lucifer experiment, but that's a totally different topic. It's been attempted in the universe 3 or 4 times, I think. It always ends up the same. It cuts the species completely off from love. They become completely, incredibly male, left-brained, and it always ends up happening. Everybody ends up being real greedy. There's no compassion, and everybody ends up fighting until the end, killing themselves or worse. 1 million years ago, the beings on Mars joined the Lucifer experiment, and it failed dramatically. Basically, they cut themselves off from the unity of the universe and created a separate reality. When the Martians severed the love bond, they became pure male, logical beings with no emotion. And what happened on Mars was they ended up fighting, and Mars became a battleground. It eventually became clear that Mars was not going to survive, and they blew away their atmosphere and destroyed the surface on the planet. Nova recently did an episode on planetary magnetics, and they found out some interesting things about Mars. The planet didn't have a magnetic system. However, the surface was magnetized, implying that it did once, and something happened to it. We've been discussing sacred geometry a lot, and the star tetrahedron is very important. I want to give you a brief understanding of the Merkaba. The Merkaba was known in ancient times as the chariot of ascension. It is the star tetrahedral energy field around your body. All around the world, there's reference to this in ancient texts. Leonardo da Vinci. There's a lot, but the Merkaba was a potential tool, and you could use it to do the impossible, essentially, included but not excluding changing dimensions, traveling through the universe. But before Mars was destroyed, they built huge tetrahedral pyramids. They built 3 4-sided and a 5-sided pyramids, and eventually building the complex, they were able to build a synthetic Merkaba. After 1 million years or so, it had been eroded, but the proof is still there. So if you look up there, you can see it. But they severed themselves from the unity consciousness, and they couldn't create a living Merkaba. They simply used it as a tool, and that was it. They tried to get away from Mars before it was destroyed, but that place that they found was called Earth. And about 65,000 years ago in our past, they saw this little vortex sitting there just pulling in life with no one on it. And they didn't ask permission. They're being part of the Luciferian experiment. They just said, all right, let's go. And they went. They stepped onto that vortex, and in doing so, they joined us and changed our evolutionary path forever. Thoth was supposedly one of the Nakalas who helped set up Atlantis, and on the islands, at the top of the Tree of Life, there was an island called Poseidon. It was a small city that Plato was discussing when he said Poseidon bore 10 children. The 10 circles on the Tree of Life, inside of it was made at the top. Essentially, that's where Poseidon was. They were rings. At the center, it was like it looked like a dartboard. At the center, it was red. Then it went black and then white. But inside of that, there was blue stones too. So it was red, blue, white, blue, black, like dartboard. And that was actually the symbol for Atlantis. The inner circle represented the Nakalas, the middle circle, the Maya, the outer circle, the Lemurians. We'll come back to that later, but in the few thousand of them that came here through the synthetic Merkaba, they used it like a traveling machine, essentially. First thing they did when they arrived in Atlantis was trying to take over the continent, and they tried to declare war and invade. However, they were really vulnerable because their numbers. We finally subdued them, you could say. Sorry about that. We stopped them from conquering, and we couldn't send them back, though. When that happened, our evolutionary path and the planetary consciousness, we were at the planetary consciousness of about a 14-year-old girl, and the Martians were an incredibly male species, and they were also really old for us. So it was like a 14-year-old girl would be taken over by like a 60 or 70-year-old man. We had no choice, no matter whatsoever. The Martians just stepped in and said, like it or not, we're here. And they didn't care what we thought or felt about it. Really is no different from the settlers in North America and what they did to the North Americans. Once the initial concept was over, once you get the initial concept over it, it becomes clear, They decided to try to understand the female thing that they lacked, this emotional feeling, which they had none of at all. But more or less for a while, the Martians slowly began to implement their left brain technologies with the Atlanteans. And we knew nothing about this kind of stuff. So the Martians kept putting out these left brain inventions until the Atlantean brain slowly began to shift. And we slowly became a male species. The Martians gained control bit by bit until eventually they had all the power, as with their attention and their animosity between Atlantis and the Martians. It never subsided, even until the end of Atlantis. They hated each other. It was almost like a marriage that the female just didn't like it, but the male just didn't really give a shit. It remained that way for a really long time, till about 26,000 years ago, when the next phase slowly began. Before we continue, we have to talk about polar shifts. In the 1930s, Edward Casey was channeling information for geologists, and he stopped and he said, "There's something you should know. In the near future, the Earth's poles are going to shit." And Casey was a brilliant man. He very strong connection to higher dimensions. We communicated with other beings for the human race. Ultimately, it was because of these channelings that the belief system called New Age was created. But that's just people boxing ideas, like Christianity or Muslim or Hebrew, atheism, whatever. It's just because they only understand it from like one aspect. When Casey talked to people, people listened, period. Geologists began exploring the possibility of a polar shift, and they found something remarkable. They found a string of evidence that came forth and made it seem like he knew what he was talking about. they said if there's going to be a full physical pole shift, there'd also have to be a change in the magnetic poles. And when they studied the geologists studied the rocks, they could see that there's magnetics have been changed and they hardened at certain depths. So they found the earlier magnetic poles were not where they were now, but instead they were in Hawaii. The last shift took place about 13,000 years ago. And we'll get there in that part of the story soon. They did another test, and it showed that it shifted again 26,000 years ago. Okay. So this is something really key to what's going on. Okay. They also learned that the shifts happen in a single day. It would do a complete flip or a turn 90 degrees. And there's that 90-degree number again, right? This shift happens 100 times over the last 100 million years, but Earth's speeding up now, and it's happening faster and faster. Only 13,000 years between each shift. Whole new viewpoints beginning to be understood from all this information. Sorry about that. But to give you the basics, the scientist was studying in great detail the theory that caused polar shifts, and it was still undeveloped at the time. And he came up with a theory that demonstrated to be possible that through various experiments. Through these experiments, they learned that the surface of the Earth's crust could slip over the main mass of the Earth, which continues its rotation as if nothing happened. The crust would rotate and spin out of control until it eventually settles again in a new location aligned with new magnetics. During this time, there'd be massive earthquakes, tsunamis, and devastation that would just shock the world, like completely Book of Revelations type stuff. I don't want to freak anyone out, but Edward Casey's accounts of the many ancient prophecies, including the Nostradamus and Mayan prophecies, have talked about polar shifts in one way or another. Modern science is becoming increasingly aware that there's going to be a polar shift in our near future, and it's lining up with our consciousness shift. But they don't take that aspect into account, really. It's funny, actually. Nova did reports on polar shifts. And both times, NASA shut them down. And recently, they released a new video called "Earth's Magnetic Storm," a video that shows all the evidence for pole shifts without actually using the word pole shift. It's almost as if a specific company doesn't want us knowing about this evidence, and be it like the pole shifts and magnetics and planetary magnetics being interlocking. They don't want us to know. The lines are supposed to be really straight and predictable, but they're really crossed up right now and making loops, and it's been weakening over the past 500 years, and they look a lot more skewed now. The magnetics are warped, and it's causing many problems that we've seen in the last 20 years with birds following the magnetics of the planet to migrate, and they end up in the wrong places. Beached whales, they followed my magnetics too. They let them to land where there should be water. For humans, how on the full moon, they're more like rapes, murders, violent crimes, anything like that. The lunar cycle affects the magnetics of the Earth slightly, but the magnetics are so weak right now, it's affecting how we think and act as a planet. The social structure is just like collapsing because of like this geomagnetic grid collapsing. Basically, it goes hand in hand. They line up with consciousness shifts, these polar shifts, but but Thoth lived on Atlantis, and he told us that the Earth shifted 5 times, east to west and west to east. And then basically he was saying the sun used to rise in the west, set in the east, rise in the east, set in the west. He said that he watched that 5 times from Atlantis. So that gave us a lot of insight, I guess. During the consciousness shift at the end of Lemuria, it sank beneath the ocean and Atlantis rose. And if the crust was spinning around the planet randomly, that would explain a lot of geological events like this. With our understanding of polar shifts, we can continue with the Atlantis drama about 26,000 years ago. And we were exactly were today on the precession of the equinox. We are going through our fallen asleep stage, and we are about to begin waking up. It was at this point that there was a small consciousness shift. We actually went down in consciousness instead of up. And a piece of Atlantis about the size of Rhode Island sank into the ocean. It caused a tremendous amount of fear within the Atlanteans, and because they thought they were going to lose the whole continent, like what happened with Lemuria, because of the consciousness shift, one of the bigger things they lost with their was their connection to the future. They couldn't foresee big events like they were, like the potential sinking of their home. And about 200 years after this, the fear began to subside. Both in the Bible and the Sumerian records give the account of Adam and Eve. And we recorded their children had exceptionally long lifespans. So it was like we lived 200 years back then, and after we lived like 20. We'll explain that later, but things kind of settled down for a while. About 16,000 years ago, a comet approached Earth, and because we were living at a high consciousness across all dimensions, the Atlanteans became aware of it before it hit, and a great conflict arose. The Martians, who were a minority, but even though they were in control, they wanted to blow it out of the sky. They had laser technology, and the Atlanteans thought the comet was in like divine way, and they protested. They said the comet was in divine order, and they wanted it to take place naturally and let it hit the Earth, because that was what was supposed to happen. The Martians fought the Atlanteans, but in the end, the Martians agreed, and they let it hit the Earth. And when time arrived, it came screaming in the atmosphere. It plunged into the Atlantic Ocean just off the western shore of Atlantis, kind of near Charleston, South Carolina. And it's at the bottom of the ocean now, but we're still finding remnants to this day, and it's scattered around about 4 states in the United States. We can determine that it hit about 12,000 years ago, at least. And main portion struck near Charleston, but a few fragments actually hit the main body of Atlantis, crashing into the area right where the Martians were living, killing a huge portion of the population. They were really pissed off about it, and they said, "It's it. We're divorcing you guys. You can do whatever you want, but we're going to do what we want." And just said, "We'll never listen to you guys again." You know, it's just like divorced families, basically. And then that's it. We're kind of like the children of the divorced family now. They just basically, their anger rose to meet their desire for control, and they decided to take over the Earth. They began once again to create complex Merkabas like the one they built on Mars long ago. And if they succeeded, they would have gained control of everything on the planet. But the only thing was around 50,000 years ago. 50,000 years had passed since they last built one, so they didn't quite remember exactly how to do it. And they built the buildings, and they set up the whole experiment, and threw on the switch, and lost control. The destruction was immense, and when you're in this kind of reality, you can hardly make like a greater area to create a kind of out of control Merkaba. And the experiment began to rip open dimensional levels, for like the lower ones. Basically, it's kind of like stabbing somebody in the stomach, and just how like everything just seeps in. It's the same idea. Like there's a tear, and things started to seep in, basically. It almost destroyed the Earth. It was a great environmental disaster, basically. But most of them are actually a direct cause from these events. A huge number of these lower dimensional beings were thrown out of their comfort zone and into these higher levels. They were forced into a world they didn't know or understand, basically. And to survive, they needed bodies, and began automatically entering the bodies of like every human. There were supposedly like hundreds of these lower level dimensional spirit beings inhabiting them. And it's almost like a virus, if you will. It was a catastrophe, probably the biggest that Earth has ever seen. The Nakals were just they were at an incredibly high level of consciousness, but it made them the guys of Atlantis. But they also basically achieved what today we call immortality. And it was kind of like, let's just say they figured a way to keep their body healthy and young for as long as they chose, and could choose to pass on whenever they desired it and reincarnate. But they didn't suffer a great memory loss that we do when we incarnate. They did it through their expanded consciousness and tantric interdimensional sex meditations. It's how Thoth was a priest king of Atlantis for thousands of years, basically, and stayed on Earth until about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago now. And he passed all his learning in sacred geometry on to a man named Drew Below Melchizedek. That's why I talked to you a lot about him. Your Merkaba is formed out of 3 star tetrahedrons. It's overlaid on top of each other. And 2 of them are counter-rotating, and the third is stationary. When the Merkaba is formed with the unity consciousness, it is formed internally with love. And when it's formed through the Lucifer experiment, it doesn't have that love, and it can become unstable really quick. The Martians' attempt at trying to control the world took place on one of the small islands west of Atlantis, which is known as the Bermuda Triangle today. And it's the triangle because at the top of the stationary tetrahedron, it's still kind of sticking out of the water there, the energy field is, and there's a huge electromagnetic imbalance there. And many planes and boats have been reported to go missing, and they just vanish without a trace. It's a multi-dimensional imbalance, basically, and those guys get sucked into different dimensions. It's still on the seafloor today, but it's supposed to be being corrected soon. But then the Cause did their best to save Atlantis and sent most of the lower dimensional beings back and sealed up the dimensional rift. But the situation got really bad really fast. All the economic systems collapsed. Financial, social constructs and concepts completely broke down. Everyone on Atlantis began getting sick with weird diseases, and the entire continent went into a state of survival. There's no longer living. It became about surviving. Basically, hell on earth. And the Cause had no idea what to do. They were children compared to the events that had been thrust upon them. So they prayed. They prayed to the highest level of consciousness of life in the universe, asking for help from anyone who could hear them. It was reviewed on many high levels of life, and like the 11th and 12th dimensions are completely incomprehensible to us in our current state, so you can't really even ponder on that too much. But what they told us is we were going to fall. We're going to hit rock bottom, level 1, the lowest place we could be in the universe and still survive. Also, we were changing polarity. We were no longer going to be a female species. We were going to start from square one as a male species. And the shocker was we'd have 13,000 years to return to Christ consciousness. That usually takes hundreds of thousands of years for a species to get to Christ consciousness. But we had to do it in a fraction of the time. If we didn't, we wouldn't survive. And this has never happened before in the universe, ever. Thoth, who was a priest king of Atlantis at the time, learned that they'd have to perform an experiment on themselves, and they received instructions from the highest levels of life, and they went on. Thoth, Ra, and Aragot were the kings of Atlantis, if you will. They began an experiment, and they had to build consciousness grids around a planetary grid with a etheric crystalline structure that envelops the planet and holds the consciousness of our being inside of so the grid has an electromagnetic component associated with the third dimension, but it also has a component for every dimension as well. And these grids are geometric, and science will eventually discover that there's a grid for every species in the world. But each of these grids has their own geometry, and it's unique. There's not one or another that are like for different species. They're all unique. These grids give off light and can be seen from space. It's the source of the bluish glow around the Earth. Thoth is Ra and Aragot had to create a synthetic Christ consciousness grid, allowing humans to ascend to Christ consciousness in a very short time. But first, let's talk about the science behind the grid. If you heard of the 100 monkey experiment, There was a research over 30 years, and they were researching a species of monkey called the Makata on the island of Japan. They're providing the monkeys with sweet potatoes by dropping them into the sand. The monkeys liked sweet potatoes, but they hated the sand. So a few monkey children started washing their sweet potatoes, and some of them taught the technique to their parents. Out of the few of the monkeys, only them did it, and then eventually it was a technique that all the monkeys knew, and once it hits a critical mass, it starts spreading, right? It spread faster than it did before, and they started learning it across the islands that were not even connected. Okay, so the monkeys literally didn't travel across these islands or into the mainland, but all the monkeys knew how to do it. Yeah, it was because the consciousness grew. We started to understand how a species was connected to itself. So what do? We tried it on humans. A research team made a picture of human faces, about 100 faces hidden within a single picture. But at first glance, you could only see about 6 or 7. They did several surveys with a few hundred people in Australia. And they said, all right, find the faces. Most people could only pick out 6, 7, or 8, maybe 9. Not many after that. The research team went to Britain and aired it on the TV, on the BBC special in England, and they showed all the faces. It was closed cable just right there. And then the research team stayed in Australia. They did the experiment again with new subjects, and lo and behold, people just naturally able to see more faces. After this experiment, they knew something definitely connects us all. The field of noetics is learning more daily about mass consciousness. There's basically 3 levels of consciousness, and each of them has their own consciousness grid around the planet. Many of the governments of the world, especially the Russian and the U.S. governments, were studying the grids back in the 60s, probably earlier. They're mapping out the grid for the planet. And if you do that, if you map it out, you can find on the primary nodal points on the grid, there are tons of these little military bases in the middle of nowhere on islands like Guam. This couldn't be a coincidence. These government powers placed these all were in the vortexes on the grid. And it was like they were trying to take control of the grid. And if you take control of the grid, you control consciousness. You control what we think and what we feel and everything. There's, of course, another organization that had both had their hands in both these governments and still do, and we'll discuss them soon. But this grid is visible through astral projection as well. 13,000 years ago, it began. Ra, Thoth, and Ergot wanted to create a global complex that was able to build a synthetic Christ consciousness grid and get us from nothing to Christ consciousness in 13,000 years' time. First thing they did was go to a place called the Giza Plateau. Back then it was known as the land of Chem, and it was a rainforest back then, not desert. They created a grid around the planet, 4th dimensionally, and they began to construct the 4th physical 3rd dimension. So they went to the male energetic axis of the Earth and created a complex. And these men were 6-dimensional beings at the time. They were living in a very high level of consciousness. So whatever they thought happened instantly, and it was that simple. So according to Thoth, he built the Great Pyramid, not the Egyptians. Thoth says that it was built 200 years prior to the pole shift, and they built it quickly. These pyramids are aligned precisely with both the Fibonacci and golden mean spirals emanating from out of the solar cross. Interesting enough, Edward Casey also channels, but the pyramids were constructed in this time, and they were the pyramids were also found to be built from the top down. So the top stones were placed first, which baffled researchers ever since. And ever since time goes on, the more we learn about the pyramids, the further into the darkness we go to understanding how they were formed. If what Thoth says is true, well, that explains everything. So there, Thoth and his buddies constructed an entire network of temple structures along the grid, 4th dimensionally, placing them on the nodes with a synthetic Christ consciousness grid. Creating all of them, they made a Fibonacci and golden mean ratios, and they were mathematically referred back to the solar cross of Egypt. The pyramid of creation of all the sacred sites being aligned was no accident. It was a single consciousness that created them. From Machu Picchu to Stonehenge, you name it. There are a few exceptions, but most were created by a single awareness as part of a unity consciousness grid. Although the Great Pyramid was done all at once, these ancient structures of the world were fourth dimensionally and slowly dropped in frequency until they manifested in the third dimension over a long period of time. Richard Hoagland researched, brought forth a bunch of stuff about Mars and the sacred sites and extrapolated from one another. It's a pretty hot topic of discussion and a lot of videos on that. But there's simple geometric relations between all the sacred sites that make stars and all kinds of major spiritual symbols. For all of them to be put in place for this Christ consciousness grid so it could manifest in a way that, think of wiring up like giant wireless electrical system, right? And then it needs 13,000 years of continuous energy flow for it to actually turn on, all right? So once it turned on, blam. The grid was completed. It came to life and is now active, but it's not really used that much. We actually survived the whole cataclysm, what Thoth was trying to avoid. And the Emerald Tablets, there are 12 tablets in total. They were formed from a substance created through an alchemical transmutation. They're imperishable, resistant to all elements and corrosion. Their atomic structure is fixed in place, and there's no change that can ever take place. In that respect, it violates the material laws of ionization. These tablets share great wisdom, and you can read them at over 100 different levels of consciousness and always understand them differently. If you're interested in this stuff, you should definitely consider reading them. As you can probably tell, Thoth plays a pretty large role in what happened. Most of this information comes from him. So, yeah, if you want to read about the flower of life and its geometric relationship to consciousness with us, and this stuff's tied intimately with the geometry of the universe, considering the quality and quantity of information that Thoth shares, it makes you really start considering that this next part can be true. The Great Pyramid is a legendary missing capstone. According to Emerald Tablets, deep under the Great Pyramid, there's a room called the Hall of Records. It was a room not built by folks, and it long predates the Atlantean civilizations, and the Hall of Records is the capstone of the pyramid, which is 5.5 inches high, solid gold, and has a holographic image of the Great Pyramid. It has all the little rooms and everything. However, this leaves us with the 24 square foot piece of the Great Pyramid that's missing. If what Thoth says it's true, it's the missing piece actually belongs to a very special spaceship that exists on Earth still to this day, under the Sphinx. According to Thoth, 12,000 years old. The Sphinx is 12,000 years old, not 12,000 years old. It's over 5.5 million years. And deep under the Sphinx, there's about 1 mile down. There's where he parked his spaceship. It's the oldest synthetic object on the Earth. It's about 2 city blocks in size. It's a round disc, has a flat bottom and top. It's also about 3 atoms thick, except for the pattern on top, and 5 atom thick. It says it's powered by consciousness and feelings, and it becomes an extension of you and your own energy, essentially. And it's also intimately connected with the Earth as it's kind of like the protector of the whole planet. It's when I was saying that it was 5 atoms thick, there's a flower of life symbol engraved on it. That's 5 atoms thick. The 24 feet thick is how thick the spaceship is to make up for the missing part of the pyramid. And if you did it, it perfectly squared the circle, so to speak, of the Great Pyramid. It creates an image from above that looks like a circle with equal circumference as the square, right? So the perimeter of the Great Pyramid is the golden golden mean ratio, phi and all that. But the spaceship can be only used by only the purest souls. And it says distinctly that the beings will come, invaders will come, and you have to go below the Sphinx and raise the ship out, and we can defeat these invaders real easy. But it's crazy stuff to put in there. Right before the consciousness shift, things get chaotic usually, and they're often usually a species that usually wish to step in and take us over. It doesn't always happen, but with all evolving consciousness, every time a takeover seems imminent, a very pure person will find their way to the ship, raise it into the air, and in between the earth and the sun, and they will give that person the great power that whatever that person thinks and feels will happen. And if you think about it, consciousness is a primary core component of the entire planet. Doesn't it make sense that they would have a defense mechanism? It plugs into the earth and the sun, allowing the earth to have protection. Supposedly, a takeover event already tried to happen the same year the Christ consciousness grid was turned on back in 1989. We were having trouble with the Greys. They're slowly plotting to take over the world, supposedly. And we were having a very pure woman in Peru made the ascension process into the Christ consciousness grid and found the ship. She turned it into the frequency of the fourth dimension, where she raised it to there. And into there, manifested the situation for the Greys for the Greys to begin getting sick, basically. And they remained sick as long as they stayed here, so they were forced to leave. And that's what it says. When you're reading these books and channeling from Thoth, basically whatever the person will think in the situation will kind of come manifest. If you go back to completing the complex in Egypt, Thoth returned to Atlantis we waited for about 200 years until the critical point on the precession of the equinox where the poles would shift, and they knew Atlantis would sink and they would be ready. So they basically had the plan fulfilled, went to wait for it to come manifest, and they saw the signs of the polar shifts. They raised the ship, they loaded up the Nacals, and they were basically all working in unity to create a very powerful Merkaba around themselves in the ship. They returned to the Great Pyramid and landed on top of it, creating the phi ratio with the pyramid. And then it happened. The poles began to shift. Consciousness began to plummet. And simultaneously, the electromagnetic and magnetic fields of the Earth collapsed. And all life and planet went into the Great Void. For 3.5 days of absolute blackness, describe many of the ancient cultures in the world. Emerald tablets say that whenever you go through a polar shift, you go through a void of space and we change our frequencies. About 3.5 days. There's also a document that depicted this with stones. But the electromagnetic null zone that the pole shift phenomenon takes place, everything just seems to disappear for a certain amount of time. It's usually between 2 to 4 days. This last one time it was 3.5 days. This is where it gets interesting. What happens to us is usually not normal for a species, because most advanced species will have their Merkabas working at the time of the shift. We didn't, so we got sucked into the void without protection, and it resulted in us losing our memories as memories. We realize all our memories are connected through cells in our brains, as well as fields around our heads. And what's not entirely understood is the connection in our memories has to do with the planet itself. We discussed this before, but the magnetics on the Earth affect how we think and act. The Merkaba and the electromagnetic field that you create around your body can serve as protection from the void as you're consciously going through it. We didn't have protection, and we just got a clean wipe. We existed on Atlantis. We were living at a very high level of consciousness in a higher dimension. We had extremely advanced and sophisticated bodies, and we were capable of practically anything, living in a dimension where molecules were spaced so far apart, the consciousness could interact with them without physically moving. It's hard to explain because you can literally shape your environment immediately through your consciousness in these higher frequencies. And then in that sense, we're creators, knowing and understanding oneness, being beings of love. We understood things, and then we fell down, into this third dimension. Consciousness fell back down to zero. The pineal gland actually shrunk in size and is now like a little bit bigger than a raisin, when it used to be like baseball sized or a little bit smaller than a ball. The energy that we weren't able to breathe in this solar energy anymore, and our lifespan went from like 900 years to what we experience about now. So we're kind of like a supercomputer that gets completely wiped out with no operating system or anything. We just had advanced physical bodies, but we didn't know how to use them. That's why today we're so physically advanced, pretty much completely all the other animals in this third dimension, but don't know how to use it. We were literally like hairy barbarians before these times, and then we had to rediscover like everything, Basically, the worship that protected them, that the Nicals, they would have lost their memories too, but it protected them, so they had this Merkaba around it. When they came out of the void, they began to go back to work. One of the third of the Nicals went to the island of the sun in Bolivia. Aragot and 1/3 went to Tibet, and the remaining went to Egypt with Thoth. Now we're going to begin bridging the gaps between the story and our current culture, between the fall of Atlantis and the dawn of our first civilization, who are the Egyptians and the Sumerians. There was a 6,500-year gap between them. What was happening to us in that time? We have to look at this precession chart, basically, again. So when you're thinking about falling asleep, waking up stages, 13,000 years, apart. There's about 6,500 years. So we started to rise upward again, DNA is like the physical manifestation of who you are, and it's your soul's physical aspect. What we're seeing is like a change in the codons, and there's 64 possible codons in the DNA, and humans only have about 22 or so. What we're finding is that there's 6 more codons being activated, and in children nowadays. So these kids that we call indigo and crystal children and super psychics are they have these extra chromosomes being activated. It's like every soul is like aware of their consciousness, and what our Thoth tells us, that every level of consciousness seen has its own grid, but it's also its own chromosome change. So what Da Vinci was drawing with the man and the wheel, he was drawing like the Merkaba around you, and the male and female energies. So like the level 5 of consciousness, it's like Metatron, essentially. It's like 50-foot tall, like craziness. And third level of consciousness, you're like 10 to 16 feet tall. Fourth level, you're 33 to 35 foot tall, because it goes in hand in hand with the sacred geometry principles. It's crazy. So Metatron was like the perfection of what humanity would become. And that's Metatron's cube. If you look at that, like I said, you can take the sacred geometry and base it off a person. His height would be about 55 foot tall. That's in the distant future for us, though. In the place of Egypt today, you can notice these structures and statues are huge, right? But it shows you a lot about like DNA, and maybe there's the beings are around the 60-foot range. So those beings would stand at the 5th level of consciousness. And the other ones on like other walls are 30 foot tall, 35 foot tall, so they'd be on like the 3rd level of consciousness. Archaeologists just thought it was talking about importance, like, oh, that man was more important. But that's not what it meant. They were talking about levels of consciousness. And according to today's archaeologists and researchers, the Egyptians and Sumerians both began their civilizations right around the same time from each other within a few hundred years or so. But these civilizations emerged out of nowhere with perfect writing abilities that were not proved upon since they first emerged. They were extremely sophisticated and then slowly degenerated over the generations. No archaeologist can explain how this happens. And they put it into its own classification they call stair-step evolution. Is because they can't explain it. It's because there's interference, right? Somebody's interfering and raising the consciousness level. If you were to look at the breakthroughs in a graph, it would look like a stair step, right? So there's this huge secret underground city where these like ascended masters were waiting beneath the Great Pyramid, and they formed what they called this Tat Brotherhood, which is a secret group that still exists today. And they're supposed to be protectors of and keepers of these sacred temples. And they're connected with the Ascended Masters about 6,000 years ago. The Brotherhood would wait until humanity needs something they were going to teach them, and they would teach them, tune into that frequency, and walk up, tell the people the info flat out, and then just like phase out once they knew how to do it. And wait, sit around and do the process, and repeat it over and over and over again until humanity's consciousness is raised. The Sumerians described this in detail, and they wrote it down. They knew about Nibiru, the precession of the equinoxes, the fall of Atlantis. They knew about it all. And then we started to fall asleep yet again. We came from a knowing state to a guessing state. And now we're coming back to that awakening state. And I believe it touched on most of what I wanted to get onto in this part. And there'll be a part 4, of course. But I'm pretty sure crammed as much as I could into that. And yeah, hope you guys enjoy.